What a blessing. Well, last week you heard from Pastor Ginger about King Hezekiah, who ascended to the throne of Judah around 715 BC, where he reigned for about 29 years. Hezekiah came to the throne after the death of his father Ahaz. Now, Ahaz was one of those kings of Judah that did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord. In addition to that description, he is also one of those kings who, we are told, did not follow the Lord as King David did. Those two things are combined often as how we describe the kings who succeeded King David and Solomon in the course of the history of the kingdom of Israel, which is now a divided kingdom. The northern kingdom has split off and has gone to ruin, run over by the Assyrians, and they have been exiled, and only a remnant remains in that geographic area, the northern tribes of Israel. Now, what was behind that? Well, we first hear about it when David commits his terrible sins with that affair with Bathsheba and what he had done to her husband Uriah to cover up what he had done. But what really led to this division and the destruction of the kingdom of Israel was what his son Solomon did. You'll never hear any of these kings compared to Solomon, because Solomon, at the end of his reign, became one of them, one of those who did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. What did he do? What did Solomon do? It was much more terrible than what David did. He abandoned his faith, is what he did. Most of us only remember Solomon about the wise king and all the great stories and the proverbs that are attributed to him. But if you read towards the end of his reign, he allowed the cultural gods, the Canaanite gods, to enter into the everyday life of his court and the sacred worship of the people of Israel. And we were even told that he began following those gods as well. Like his father, he did have a woman problem. 700 wives and 300 concubines. I can't even imagine. The culture took over Solomon's court in a big way. And so every king that succeeded Solomon, whether for the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom after they split off, were compared to how they performed as what they did. Was it right in the sight of God? And did they follow as David did? No matter what his sins were, he never abandoned his faith, and that was the test. Well, most kings, as Ahaz, failed miserably at that. But Hezekiah is one of those exemplary exceptions. What motivated Hezekiah to do what was right in the eyes of the Lord? Well, it's what he witnessed his father did. Back in chapter 29 of 2 Chronicles, he talks about that as he addresses the priests, the Levites, and those who would be leading worship, as he reforms the faith and spiritual practices of the people and brings them back to right worship, temple worship. Here's what he says. Our ancestors have been unfaithful and have done what was evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They have forsaken him and have turned away their faces from the dwelling of the Lord and turned their backs. They also shut the doors of the vestibule and put out the lamps and have not offered incense or made burnt offerings in the holy place to the God of Israel. They shut down the temple. Ahaz shut down the temple. Therefore, the wrath of the Lord came upon Judah and Jerusalem, and he has made them an object of horror, of astonishment, and of hissing, as you see with your own eyes. Our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons and our daughters and our wives are in captivity for this. Now it is in my heart, says Hezekiah. It's in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his fierce anger may turn away from us. My sons, those of you who will be leading us in this reformation of our worship and life together of faith, do not be negligent, for the Lord has chosen you to stand in his presence to minister to him and to be his ministers and make offerings to him. Ahaz believed that the miserable condition, his experiences in leading Judah, was the fault of God. The cultural gods of the kingdoms and the peoples who were constantly raiding Judah and pillaging and raping and carrying off their people as slaves was because their gods were stronger. And so he decided that that's what he'll do. He'll introduce their gods into the lives of the people of Judah. Back in chapter 28, in the time of his distress, he became even more faithless to the Lord, this same King Ahaz. He shut up the doors to the house of the Lord and made himself altars in every corner of Jerusalem. In every city of Judah, he made high places to make offerings to other gods. If that wasn't bad enough, what motivated Hezekiah was very probably witnessing his father Ahaz sacrificing his brothers, Ahaz's other sons. He sacrificed his human sacrifices to these Canaanite gods and even to the gods of Assyria. It's what often happens when we see others prosper and we somehow don't make it. When we see others powerful and we feel powerless, we look for what we're doing wrong and what they're doing right. And we begin to abandon our own ideas of morality, our own values, and say that's the way we need to be. That's the shortcut to prosperity and power. Well, Hezekiah did see the ruin of Judah and Jerusalem. He saw it was caused by adopting the worship of these gods of the surrounding cultures. And so he decides to reform and bring back the right worship, the right spiritual practices. And you heard Ginger talk about that last week. He tried to reunite the kingdom. He invited the remnant that was still remaining in the northern tribes, and he got some response, but not very much. But what they all experienced, even as they kind of stumbled getting ready for that new Passover, that renewed Passover experience, they didn't quite get it right, but Scripture tells us what they failed to do through ritual cleansing, God sanctified. And it was a powerful experience. And we know it's powerful because what we encounter here in chapter 31, the response to it. We are told that all Israel who were present at this renewed Passover experience all went out to the cities of Judah and broke down the pillars, hewed down the sacred poles, and pulled down the high places and altars throughout all Judah and Benjamin and Ephraim and Manasseh. What I like about this passage here in 2 Chronicles, which is different than this account in 2 Kings, is that it says all the people went out and cut down those Asherah poles, removed those high places of worship of these Canaanite gods. The people did it. Where in 2 Kings, Hezekiah is given kind of sole credit for making this happen. And I think it's worth reflecting on this difference between Hezekiah doing these things and the people actually doing these things in response to his modeling. I believe it's really important as we, as a people, struggle through this presidential election that seems to have a longer life than COVID. And really any presidential election for that matter. What I heard way too much and continue to hear way too much of is an expectation that our elected officials will do for us what we as a people should be doing for ourselves, beginning in our own lives. Too many of us want to delegate our morality to an elected political leader. I can't emphasizing, you cannot legislate morality. And those you think you can, let me add this. God is never impressed by what we do or don't do because some human law says it's legal or not. He is only impressed by what we do from our hearts. You cannot legislate it. And the idea that we are going to legislate personal morality, that train left the station in the 60s. As far as individual personal morality is what anyone thinks it is in our culture and society. And we have to get used to that and just accept it. The issue is it does not change a thing in your heart, or at least it should not, but it does. The more the culture follows its own desires, sets its own morality, the more we are drawn along with it. And we need to draw the line. And that line is not in a political election, it's in your heart and my heart. And that's where it starts. And brothers and sisters, that's where it ends. So it is important that the people, not Hezekiah, remove those sacred poles and high places dedicated for worship of false gods. It's so easy to point to the sacred poles, the Asherah poles and high places in other people's lives, and so much of the political debate is just about that. Pointing to the idols the others are worshiping. The truth is both sides of the political debate have more than their fair share of idols in their lives. And those idols surface when we start pointing at others what their idols are. And we ignore the idols and the places we worship in our lives. These idols are sprinkled into all of our lives. When I hear someone represent something called the Christian right, I cringe. They even labeled evangelicals, and that makes me feel worse because I'm an evangelical, amen? I don't know what they're talking about. But I'm an evangelical. I'm a spreader of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We need to realize that these idols are in all of our lives, whether we're religious right or the left, evangelical, conservative, liberal, they're there. The culture is a powerful force. It is a worldly force, and it has a ruler. Jesus called him the ruler of the world, and his name is not Donald Trump or Joe Biden. He is present on both sides of the political debate. When we look to a political leader to determine what we believe, what we know is right or wrong, we surrender our very being as a child of God. Hezekiah was a great king and leader, but he only could do so much and only accomplish so much. You may find out next week, I hope I don't spoil it for Pastor Ginger, because as you read on, his son immediately returns to the practices of his grandfather Ahaz. When we look to our political leaders for how we should behave, it's a fleeting moment of time in history. It begins and ends in our heart. Each of us need to examine how the idols of our culture are sprinkled into our everyday lives and get rid of them before we get too excited about the idols of our culture in other people's lives. In some ways, this is more difficult for us as Christians because we carry the conflict in our heart. If you're not a believer, if you're not a person of faith, You're ruled by the culture. You don't have a conflict. But we have that special burden. We have that responsibility to sort this out in our own hearts and not let the culture have a say in anything. Christ came to confront the culture, not for a body of people, the chosen people, but for you and me and every individual. As I began to reflect on this, and you've heard me talk about this two ways, because some translations call these poles sacred poles. But you heard in the reading, I believe it probably came from the NIV, Asherah Poles. Asherah was the queen mother of the gods of the Canaanite pantheon. She was it. El was the supreme being, but she was his consort. And her presence was manifest throughout the Canaanite world, the world that Moses brought the people into that promised land. And they were warned about it. You can go back to Deuteronomy, and Moses warns about these poles. They're there. She's a powerful force, the queen mother. And Jeremiah speaks about her. He calls her the queen of heaven. She's a powerful presence. And she's in all of our lives. Not only was she there before the Israelites got there, before they became known as the Israelites, she even found her way into their worship of the God of Israel. In their thinking, they get enmeshed in the culture. They thought God needed a consort. And so there's evidence that people of faith of the one God of Israel had these Asherah poles right alongside, invested in those places in which they were supposed to be worshiping God, because God needed a wife. And of course, once you let Asherah in, anything begins to happen. And that's what happens in our lives too. Once we let one in, it just continues to erode our relationship with God and Jesus Christ. As I was preparing this and thinking about examples, I recalled an event that happened this year. COVID time is like dog years. 8 months seems like 8 years ago. But if you remember, we had a Super Bowl, a regular Super Bowl, 8 months ago. Can you remember who played the game? Do you remember the halftime show? The answer to that was the 49ers and Kansas City Chiefs, and the Chiefs won. But do you remember the halftime show? Raise your hand if you remember the halftime show. Well, it was the most controversial halftime show since Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction in 2004. It got a lot of media attention. The stars of the show were Jennifer Lopez and Shakira. And the dance performance was a bit over the top. A lot of people were upset about how sexually suggestive they were. Their costumes were too scanty, just revealed too much. And then they involved children, including Jennifer Lopez's daughter in the routine. And they thought, with all this going on, why should she be there? But one particular aspect of Jennifer Lopez's routine was a pole dance. Now, for whatever reason, a lot of people associate a pole and a dance routine with something that goes on in those things that we euphemistically call gentlemen's clubs. They're strip clubs. And this is called euphemistically called exotic dancing. It's just stripping. And so that right away caught the attention of the nation. Well, I actually saw that, and I didn't really see anything more suggestive than I saw at Mechanicsville Recreation Center for Saturday night dances back in the 60s. You know, that what became what we call dirty dancing. So this happened a long time ago. But as Jennifer was asked about how she felt about this, she felt that she was honoring her Latino culture. And she was demonstrating an empowerment of women, not objectifying, not, gratifying sexual desire. And she felt strongly about this. And she felt she was appropriately modeling this for her children, particularly her daughter. Well, I saw a couple of interviews after the performance, one particular on Saturday night, the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. And you were struck by, how much life you saw in Jennifer Lopez as she was talking about this. How she felt she had done something she was very proud of. It was the performance of a lifetime for her. She had always looked forward to that opportunity, and she prepared intensely for it. So Jimmy asked her, what was it like to get ready for this? Because the media was praising her, the over the top for her dance and performance. But even, and rightfully so, her athleticism and dancing on that pole, it was pretty incredible for someone of any age, much less a woman of 51 years old. And so he asked her what she did in preparation. And she talked about her morning. Now, this is Super Bowl what? Super Bowl Sunday. We kind of just let that roll out, we as Christians in this culture, without thinking twice about it. So right away, we've kind of eased into the culture when we start talking about the Super Bowl and all that goes on around that on what day? So she gets up early in the morning and she has a workout to get pumped. She calls her choreographer and runs through all the routines before she has to get to the stadium. She has to get to the stadium 4 hours ahead of time because of the traffic and everything else. And she talks about that time. She talks about that time at the stadium. And to my surprise, but what I saw as an absolute genuineness, a genuine sincerity. She said, during that time, I prayed. And she shared what she prayed right there on the Tonight Show. She said, God, just help me embrace the moment, be in the moment, to do my best and feel good. She said, I didn't want to miss out on experiencing it because of my anxiety or nervousness. So she prayed to God to calm her spirit so she could do this well. Well, whatever you or I thought or think about her Super Bowl halftime show, her performance, what it represented, what we think about the Latino culture and their dance, let me tell you, watching us do it at Mechanicsville Presbyterian Church, the Latinos are much better at it. Not the Presbyterian, the Recreation Center, not in the church. What we think about the football culture, what we think about the celebrity culture, I hope you agree that hearing about Jennifer praying before her performance makes what we think, what we judge about all of that more complicated. And that's what happens when faith and culture collide. Things get more complicated. Not because they are complicated, because we make them complicated. We are all struggling in our time with the complications of living out our faith over and against the way our culture calls us to live, just as they were struggling in King Hezekiah's time. And what did he do? He made it very simple. we're going to worship. And we're going to worship right. And we're going to dedicate our lives to our faith. It wasn't complicated anymore. You have to think about all the cultural gods around them. It just became that simple. I'm not picking on Jennifer Lopez, but whether she wants to be or not, she is a cultural icon. Like the athletes who performed that day. Like the athletes who probably prayed very similar prayers before they played the game and during the game. On Super Bowl Sunday. The fact that they were pulling us away from our worship never entered any of their minds. Or if it did, they got over it in a hurry. I just see the whole Super Bowl thing, including the halftime performance, as emblematic of the struggle we all share between our faith and culture. For me, that symbolic connection between the Super Bowl 54 halftime performance and what was going on in Hezekiah's time is those Asherah poles and that pole dance. You know, I firmly believe that Jennifer believed she was performing as an artist. But it was an art that was defined by what? The culture. And we tend to excuse too much of what we choose to do because, you know, the culture acknowledges as what? As good. The culture encourages us to do what it considers good. I wonder how many of those condemning that Super Bowl halftime performance did miss church that day to get ready for the Super Bowl Sunday. I wonder how many of those condemning that performance that day took their kids out on a weekend for sports practices, for sports tournaments, or what you name it. If you ask church consultants who monitor these things, you know that people say now that they are a regular churchgoer if they go once a month. They consider themselves regular churchgoers. Why do they do that? Because the culture says if you go once a month, you're a regular churchgoer. What are they doing on those other 3 Sundays? They're pole dancing is what they're doing. They may as well be in a strip club as far as God's concerned. If you want to check out the Asherah Poles in your life, I want you to maybe participate with me. I guess I won't be doing this much anymore, but Pastor Ginger or others of us, when we have to try to schedule a confirmation class and work around all the pole dancing going on in our kids' lives and their families' lives. Corners we have to cut to say that they came enough to pass. I wish you could see it. The pole dancing going on in all of our lives before we begin to criticize the other side. They're there. And we erect those Asherah poles in our lives in all kinds of places that we don't like to admit. Particularly in the darkness of the night. Check out your internet activity. Check out your social media. You'll find all the Asherah poles that you can imagine in what you're doing and what I'm doing every day. It's up to us to cut down those Asherah poles in our lives, in our hearts, and make those hard decisions where we push the culture aside and say, no, it's not complicated. It's simple. Jesus Christ is the Lord of my life. It is just that simple. And it's you and me that allows the culture to make it complicated. So I hope you will join me this morning in swearing off all pole dancing. Amen.